but they weren't in common usage until the war made it necessary. And then suddenly, you know, they were using all of these on the battlefield, and as war technology does, it immediately seeped back into civilian life. And so I said, okay, she came from World War II. And that makes sense in terms of her character, because, you know, I wanted someone who was very competent and, you know, rather tough, who could take care of themselves and, you know, not be freaked out at going to the bathroom in a privy, you know, and not be like, oh my God, when they encountered cockroaches or something like that. People often say to me, oh, I love your books because you write such strong women. I keep saying, but I don't like stupid ones. Why would I write anyways, you know, it's kind of not unusual to me that cars would be a strong woman. This is just the sort of person I like. Anyway, so I began to zero in on who she was, and so I was thinking, well, she came from World War II, you know, who was she? It was not at all common for there to be female doctors at that time, and those that there were mostly on the female side. You know, they were doing obstetrics, gynecology, midwifery, as they put it in the UK, things like that, or they were general practitioners, you know, with a domestic practice. You did not find female battlefield surgeons. You did find nurses in great numbers, and these were very tough ladies, and I was thinking, that's who she is. Yeah, that's who she is. And so I proceeded on that assumption and began researching, you know, World War II nurses and so forth. The more I looked, the more convinced I was that that's where she'd come from. So then, of course, I had a better idea of her character as I began to work with her and my man in the kilt. He was just named Jamie to begin with, because of the Doctor Who episode that I watched that inspired him. I mentioned the Doctor's Companion. This young man, his character's name was Jamie McCrimmon. And it was not until years after my first book was published that I realized that the actor who played him was named Fraser Hines. This is because the local PBS channel at that point tended to cut off the credits so that they could run pledge ads, and so I never saw the credits for the actors, and no idea who they were. But anyway, he was just Jamie Blank for a long time because I knew nothing about the clan structure. I didn't know who he should be. I didn't know what the loyalties and feuds and so forth might be. So it was just Jamie Blank and, you know, Claire. And, you know, Beecham is the name of one of my high school math teachers. And I picked that just because I thought, well, she might have a tie to France at some point. That might come in handy. And I happen to know that Beecham is originally a French name, but has been, you know, co-opted into a British pronunciation. So it is in fact spelled Beauchamp, as Colin pronounces it. That would be the French pronunciation. But Mr. Beecham said, well, it's, you know, an English name now. I said, okay, fine, Beecham she is. And so she began to evolve just these small bits and pieces. As for Jamie, as I said, I was sort of doing research as I went along. I began to look into clans and things like that. And in part of my research, I came across a book called The Prince and the Heather by a guy named Eric Linklater. And this was an account of what happened after the Battle of Culloden, when Bonnie Prince Charlie fled the field and was able to escape. It took him 5 months to get out of Scotland altogether and back to France. He was, you know, actually hiding in the heather. People were protecting him and passing him from hand to hand. And Cumberland's men were hunting him. There was a bounty of 30,000 pounds on his head, which was a heck of a lot of money at the time. But nobody ever turned him in. And which goes to say something for the people of Scotland, considering what he did to them. But anyway, that being so, I read this book and thought, well, you know, eventually when I come to the Battle of Culloden, I wasn't quite sure where we were in the 18th century at this point, except around the Jacobite period. And toward the end, I came to this little passage in the book, and the man was describing what happened to the men who were left on the field after the prince fled. And he said 19 Jacobite officers who were wounded took refuge in the little farmhouse that's there on the field. It's called Leonacher Farmhouse. He said, here they lay for 2 days with their wounds untended in pain, and at the end of this time they were taken out and shot. He said, one man, a Fraser of the Master of Lovett's regiment, escaped the slaughter. The others are buried there by the farm. And so I said, well, if I expect this guy to survive the Battle of Culloden, his last name had better be Fraser. So Jamie Fraser, he became. And sometime later, as I was working along here, I thought it would be interesting if he sort of had a divided heritage. You know, he had a mother from one clan and a father from the other, so he would have ties and, you know, conflicts and so forth along those lines. And so I didn't know what his mother's clan might be, since he was Fraser. And while thinking about this, I was in the in the grocery store shopping, and I looked up above the frozen foods. It was summertime, so they had coolers and things up there. And here was one in tartan plaid with the logo Mackenzie on it. So that's why I used Jamie Mackenzie. Because people always ask where you get your ideas. Same place any writer does, you know, out of everything that you come across, anything you hear, think, smell, see, or hear. So, you know, it's just if you're thinking about things, stuff you need kind of comes and finds you. That's like if there's something you want to do, you know, start doing it. The universe will come out to meet you more often than not. At least I've always found that to be the case. So anyway, I was working along peacefully, not telling anyone what I was doing, including my husband, because he would have tried to stop me. Not out of any objection to my writing a book, but out of fear that I would drop dead. Because at this point, as I say, his business was still getting his feet under it. He was doing better, but he wasn't contributing any money to the exchequer. So I was still working a full-time job as a university professor. I was working almost full-time writing software reviews for the computer press and anything else anyone would pay me to write, including a popular science article on how to remove the flesh from a dead cow's skull in order to make a wall ornament out of it. So one of my better paying jobs, actually. It's not that hard. You cover it with wet burlap and leave it outside. Little domestic beetles come and do the job for you. But I managed to stretch that out into a 2-page article. Anyway, as I said, I had 2 full-time jobs and 3 children under the age of 6, because we weren't having kids. And so my husband would certainly have said, well, you know, wait until my business is doing better. You can quit one or both of your jobs. You know, wait till the kids are in school, which would have made lots of sense. But I just thought, you know, Mozart was dead at 36. So I thought if I didn't do it right now, I might never do it. So I didn't tell him. I just began it. Well, I must digress here again a minute and go back to being an expert in scientific computation. One day I got a software job from Byte magazine, and it was a database program they wanted me to review. And with it, they sent me a trial membership to something called CompuServe. This was the mid-1980s. The web did not exist. The internet did not exist, except in very rudimentary and mostly military form. What we had were 3 information services, Genie, Delphi, and CompuServe. And these were sort of collections of little special interest groups, or forums as they were called. And these were people who, you know, liked old cars or gardening or ancient books or something. They gave them a common interest and were willing to pay $30 an hour in order to talk to other people across the computer lines about it. And so the Byte people said, well, this database company has a support forum for their software on CompuServe. And this is just like the newest, coolest, sexiest idea ever, that you can actually log on to some place and get, you know, information about why your software isn't working. And so they said, so they want you to mention it. So would you check this out, you know, and mention it in your review? So I signed on to CompuServe, checked it out, which took about an hour, and wrote my review, and then I had 4 hours of free connect time left. Well, as I say, it cost $30 an hour to be connected back then, and while I'm not Scottish, I wouldn't waste $120 either. And so I said, what else is in here? And so I began poking around, and I stumbled into a group of people called the Literary Forum. These were people who liked books. There were a few writers there, some professional, some aspiring. Most of the people there were just readers from various paths of life, but people who liked to talk about books and writing. Well, for someone with 2 full-time jobs and 3 small children, it was the ideal social life. So I signed up, got automated software, so I didn't go broke talking to them, and, you know, began hanging around there. The CompuServe, it's now called the Books and Writers Community, but it's the same place. I've been hanging around there for 35 years now, since 1985. And, you know, still pretty much the same kind of place, a 24-hour literary cocktail party, though it diverges periodically. But, you know, it's a very nice, congenial place. And as I said, there were a lot of writers there, too. Well, I wasn't mentioning what I was doing to friends that I had online either, because I had seen a lot of people come through with some project that they had in mind, saying, oh, I'm going to write this, I'm going to write that, or I'm doing the research for this, and so forth, and I'm planning a trip to so forth to collect, you know, data for my book and all that. And you could sort of see the professional writers kind of silently rolling their eyes when they heard this, because most often none of these people would ever produce a word. You know, they just kind of fade away, or, you know, they go back to talking about something else, and nothing would ever happen. And so, well, I'm not going to do that. So I'm going to write the book first, and then I'll see if I want to tell anyone about it. So I was just working along in obscurity, and you know, I work in the middle of the night. I always have. This is how you work when you have three small children. But it happens to suit me, so I still do that. Midnight to 4:30 a.m. is my main time. And so I was working with the night, so there was no chance of my husband finding out what I was doing, at least not at that point. One night, I would break the monotony of what I was doing by logging into CompuServe every half hour or so and picking up messages. And on my next pass, I'd pass back another batch of messages. And so I found myself one night having this desultory argument with a gentleman about what it feels like to be pregnant. He said, "Oh, I know what that's like. My wife's had 3 children." I laughed, and I said, "Yeah, Buster, I've had 3 children." And he said, "Well, can you tell me what it's like?" I said, "I can, yes, but it's sort of complex. I don't think I could fit it into a 30-line message slot," which is what we had at the time. I said, "But I wrote this small piece a few months ago in which a young woman tells her brother in some detail what it feels like to be pregnant. And so it's a fairly good description. I'll put it up in the library for you." So I did. And everyone who had been following the argument went, "Read this piece." They all came rushing back and they said, "Well, this is great. What is it?" I said, "I don't know." And I said, "Well, where's the beginning?" And I said, "I haven't written that yet." And they said, "Well, put up some more of it. This is fascinating. We want to hear more about these people." And this is like heroin to a brand new writer, to have people actually want to know what you've written and be interested in reading it. And so, I hastily combed through what I had to see if there was anything else I felt safe showing them. And so gradually, over time, I began showing them more and more, just a scene here or there, maybe 5-10 pages that would stand without a lot of explanation, and put one up every 2 or 3 months. And people began saying, "This is cool, you should try and publish it." And I would say, "I don't even know what kind of book it is, and I think you have to know that before you try and sell a book." But eventually, I'm going to write a book I would like to publish, so, for the sake of argument, what should I do? Well, as I say, I knew a number of professional writers by this time, and they realized I was serious. I was actually writing, so they were very generous in sharing their advice and their stories. And all of them said, "You should get an agent." They said, "A literary agent can do 2 things for you. He or she can get your manuscript read much more quickly than if you're sending it to a slush pile," which is true. The good news is that 99.9% of what's in a slush pile is actually slush. So if you've written a halfway credible manuscript, it's got a reasonably good chance. But the bad news is that there's a lot of slush in a slush pile, and it can easily take an editor 2 years to dig her way down to, all editors are female these days, to dig her way down to your manuscript. And they said the second thing an agent can do if the book hits the right editor and does sell is to negotiate a much better contract for you than you could do by yourself. Does this make sense? And in fact, it does. My first literary contract ran 12 pages of clauses and subclauses, very Byzantine. And it's only owing to the wisdom of my first agent that I still owned my T-shirt rights and my action figure rights when the Sony Corporation came around to buy my television show. Now they own them. And my husband says he can't wait to see the Black Jack Randall action figure. So anyway, I said, "Well, this sounds like good advice. How would I find an agent?" And they said, "Well, different ways. You can go to writers' conferences, meet agents, and talk to them about your book. You can read Writer's Digest magazine. They have lists of agents. You can get one of the books, the reference books about literary agents that tells you which agents like what kinds of manuscripts and what they would like to see, and it gives you advice on how to write query letters and things like that." I said, "You can do one of the writers' organizations like Rocky Mountain Fiction Writers, Science Fiction Writers, or Romance Writers of America." These specialist groups are organized by genre, and they have lists of agents who deal with that particular genre. And they said, "Or you could just talk to people who have agents." I said, "That seems easiest, I'll do that." Because I was nowhere near finished writing the book anyway. And so I just began casually talking to people about agents. Whenever I was talking to a published writer about anything, I'd say, "Oh, by the way, do you have an agent? How did you acquire him or her? How long have you had them? If you had to change agents, how did you do it? Did you fire the first one? Did he die? What happened? And how does it all work? When they send out your book, what do they get back? And if they get rejection letters, do they tell you about them and then you rewrite the book or what? And how much do you pay them? Do you think it's worth it?" And so forth. And they were very patient about answering all my questions, and as I say, sharing the information. Well, I began slowly zeroing in on this one gentleman named Harry Nolan, who sounded like a good match for me. He was a very well-known agent. He represented several best-selling authors, as well as my friends on CompuServe, some of whom were best-selling authors. And I had learned from them that he wasn't afraid of very long books or of unorthodox books, both of which it struck me I had. And so I might be a good match, but I didn't know how to get at him because he didn't take unsolicited queries. You had to be recommended to him, or he had to come looking for you, which was not going to happen, obviously. And so I said, well, if you're not finished writing the book, go and ask him questions. Either you will find out a way to get at him, or someone else will pop up who's a good match. And so I did that. And one day I was talking to a friend named John Stiff, who writes science fiction mysteries, and I said, well, I'm asking everyone about agents. John, do you have one? He said, well, yeah. He said, by coincidence, his name is Perry Norton. He's the same as, so-and-so's. And I said, oh, really? And he said, I know you're almost ready to look for an agent yourself. Would you like me to recommend you to Perry? I said, well, yes, John, that would be very nice. I was afraid that John would leave CompuServe or be run over by a bus before I finished the book, and so I said, yes, go ahead, ask him. And so he wrote a regular typewritten note to Perry saying I was worth looking at. Perry, God rest his soul, was a much older gentleman who never touched a computer in his life. Every note I got from him had been typed, on a manual typewriter on gray linen paper. And so I followed John's recommendation with my own query. It was fairly brief. It said, dear Mr. Norton, I've been writing and selling nonfiction by myself for some years here. I said, yes, I do know what I'm doing. And people like what I write enough to pay me for it. But now that I'm writing a novel, I understand that I need good literary representation. I have done my research. And you've been recommended to me by John and Judy and Carol and Cherry and all these other people whose opinions I respect. And in fact, indicating that, yes, I know all of these people who are your clients. You can ask them about me, make sure I'm legit. And I said, you have this very long historical novel. I don't want to waste your time. I'm respectful of your evidence. Would you be willing to read excerpts from it? No, I didn't tell him I wasn't finished with the book. Excerpts were all I had. He very kindly called back and said, maybe a heart attack, and said, yes, he'd be happy to read my excerpts. So I hastily wrote a 26-page single-spaced synopsis of what I thought was going on in the book and sent it to him along with my bundle of excerpts. And he took me on the basis of an unfinished first novel, which is very unusual, both then and now, but it was very lucky for me. Well, 6 months later, I finally finished the book. And I called Perry to tell him that I was sending it to him. And I said, I can see while I was finishing the book that there's more to the story, but I thought I should stop while I can still lift it. If anyone is interested in it, you can tell me more. And he said, okay, great. And I told him also that I would be in New York the next week for a scientific conference, and he, as I hoped he would, invited me to come up to his office and meet him, because we've never seen each other face to face. So the next week, I went up to Perry's office in some trepidation of mind, because at this point, he was the only person in the world who read the whole book, and I didn't yet know what he thought about it. So I got up there, and as I say, turned out to be a charming older gentleman, took me back to his office, got me a Diet Coke, and was putting me at my ease, or so he thought, by telling me about various of his other clients. I say as he thought, because at this point I learned that in addition to my CompuServe friends, he also represented Tony Hillerman, Frederick Forsyth, and Robertson Davies, and the estate of Ayn Rand. And I was sitting there thinking, if you have the nerve to call Robertson Davies, Robbie, you're a better man than I am. But what was really unnerving was that he had my manuscript sitting on the desk in front of him in the huge orange box in which I shipped it. And I was sure that at some point he was going to push it back at me and say, well, now that I've read it, it's just too weird. There's nothing I can do with it, but you'll keep me in mind if you read anything else. And so I was expecting at any moment to hear this. Instead, he said, the thing about Freddie Forsyth and Robbie Davies and those guys is that they're all great storytellers. He put a hand on the box and smiled at me and said, and you're another one. I was so gratified I didn't hear what he did with the book that it scraped together enough wits to ask. And he said, oh, I'm sending it out today to 5 editors who I think might like it. And he ran down the list and told me who they were and why he thought they might like it. And I said, well, that's great. How soon do you think we might hear back from them? Because I had in mind, 18 months, 2 years, and so forth, what I've been reading in Writers Market. And he said, oh, I've told them all I want an answer in 30 days. And I'm thinking, well, you picked the right agent. So I don't have to wait for 30 days. Well, 4 days later, I got a message on my answering machine. You can tell how old I am from this. I'm 63, if you were wondering. Anyway, it said, this is Perry. I just called to update you about your manuscript. And so I said, well, the 5 he sent it to, at least one of them said, here, it's too long. I'm not reading a 10-pound book. Take it back. So I called up expecting to hear that. Instead, he said, well, the 5 I sent it to, so far 3 of them have called back with offers to buy it. So he was able to negotiate amongst them for the next 2 weeks. He merged with a 3-book contract, and I was a novelist.